This is actually a topic that's close to my heart personally, because as an educator, it was my first year teaching, and I actually taught in a middle school, and it was a self-contained class, meaning that the students stayed with me all day. Typically, our students were in my classroom if they were on the spectrum, so if they were on the autism spectrum, but also that they had a lot of behaviors. But I had a student in that classroom that was very different than the rest of my students. And she was actually adopted from Romania. And she was formally diagnosed with an attachment disorder. And that was the first time me as an educator had ever heard of anything like that. But of course, it sent me a little bit on a journey because any educator that has, a child that's new to their classroom, that they're not familiar with certain diagnoses, you know, hopefully those educators will go and do research. And so it really began a journey for me on understanding the role of attachment, understanding the adoption, the impact of children in foster care, children that have experienced hard things. And so, all to say that we even had a brain balance in a therapeutic residential boarding school that I worked at for 3 years, working specifically with teenagers. And many of our teenagers, I would say 100% of them, had experienced hard things and some adverse experiences that really can impact brain development and brain function. So, all to say, being in brain balance for over 16 years, I've had the privilege to work with several families that have had children that have had adverse experiences. And so today we're really going to talk about that and really look at what does adverse experiences do to brain development? And then also what can you do about that? Because the good news is that in children and even in young adults, we now know that the brain can change. We can improve the function of the brain. So hopefully my goal for you today is that you have more of an understanding of what's going on, perhaps in your child and in their brain, but then also too that you will walk away with some hope and also some good tools to be able to activate their brain and see their brain grow and develop. So, let's talk about early childhood experiences. When we think about adverse childhood experiences, typically that means traumatic experiences. It could be neglect, so meaning that they weren't taken care of. They didn't have the sensory stimulation, the motor stimulation, the interactive stimulation that a baby or a child should have. So lack of also it could also mean lack of prenatal care of the mother. It could mean toxin exposure. So toxin exposure while the baby's in utero, toxin exposure maybe after the baby was born. But all these things and all these experiences or adverse experiences really can show up as symptoms such as hypervigilance or hyperactivity or anxiety and depression, meltdowns. Perhaps you have a child that is struggling with bedwetting, sensitivity to clothing, hoarding. Perhaps they're hoarding food or they're hoarding certain toys or things. You can have a child that may be struggling with lying, lack of empathy, also difficulties just having relationships, the difficulty of learning. So, all to say that when there are adverse experiences that occur with children, it can present themselves in very different symptoms, and often can have diagnoses that are linked to more of the symptoms versus really understanding what's going on in the brain. So, here's another question for you. Have you or your child been through a difficult experience like those mentioned, such as trauma, maybe being bullied? Extensive bullying can also be a traumatic experience. Perhaps it was neglect, toxin exposure, and now have a diagnosis, or they're struggling with difficult symptoms, perhaps some of the symptoms that I just described. Now, all to say, many of our children actually that come to Brain Balance, they may not even have a formal diagnosis yet, but they are displaying some symptoms that are a bit concerning. And so many times that is also something that we see in our centers. But it looks like for you guys that 72% of you say yes, that your child has been through something like we have described. Also, too, if you are a professional and you work with children that have experienced adverse experiences, please put your name in the Q&A box and tell us what city you're zooming in from and your email address, and we will for sure love to connect with you and provide you some professional tips and resources specifically that we have for professionals. So I know oftentimes we have a lot of professionals that are on our webinars, so welcome as well. So the Center for Disease Control, they have the longest study. It's called the ACEs study, and it's the longest study that really is researching the connection with adverse childhood experiences and a diagnosis of ADHD and anxiety disorders. It's a longitudinal study that actually started way back. I believe it was in the late 60s, early 70s, and continues to this day, where they're really looking at the long-term impact of adverse childhood experiences. And what they found is that it can impact a lot of things, not only from specifically brain development, which we're going to talk about today, but also physical ailments and your overall physical health as you become older. So it's a fascinating research study, and yet, it's continuing to go on. And so it's something that's very fascinating. Now, there are several diagnoses that often can be linked to a child that has experienced adverse effects. Number one is symptoms of ADHD, right? So this is inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivities, symptoms that interfere or reduce the quality of social, school, and work functioning. So when we look at the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, it's something where there has to be multiple symptoms in multiple environments. So it needs to impact their school, social, and or work functioning. And you see it in a variety of environments. Now, symptoms of anxiety, okay, or the criteria needed for a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder is that your child constantly feels on edge, can easily be fatigued, they have difficulty with concentrating, they can have irritability, muscle tension, and sleep disturbance. And actually, it has to be for greater than 6 months that you see a continual type of symptoms of anxiety. And then we have attachment. And attachment symptoms would be developmentally inappropriate social behaviors, having difficulties and trouble connecting with a caregiver, can be easily withdrawn, can avoid eye contact, and perhaps even avoid physical touch. So those are different symptoms that can also lead to a criteria for a diagnosis in ADHD, a diagnosis in an anxiety disorder, or even a diagnosis in an attachment disorder. Now, here's another question for you. Your child or young adult has a formal diagnosis of what? Is it ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, oppositional defiance, sensory processing, or perhaps they're undiagnosed, but you're concerned, or there's another diagnosis that we haven't mentioned. All to say that one of the things that I want to highlight here is if you actually look at the criteria for a diagnosis, it's really just a list of symptoms, right? And that's what we're going to be talking about today is more or less of what is the root cause of why you're seeing these symptoms that could cause your child to have a diagnosis. So sure enough, you guys say that 54% are diagnosed with ADHD, 26% for anxiety disorder, 32% is another diagnosis, 32% are not diagnosed at all, but you have concerns, and then 13% for oppositional defiance and 13% for sensory. And that's very common. And that's why we bring this up, is because many times children that have experienced hard things, they often are diagnosed with one of those disorders. And ADHD is one of the most prevalent. But we're going to talk about why that is, and then also what's really, again, going on in the brain. So first, I want to share with you guys, how does the brain develop? Well, the brain develops with appropriate sensory exposure, appropriate motor movement, and also they have to have several environmental experiences and social experiences. Okay, so you need appropriate sensory input and exposure, appropriate motor exposure and movements through a variety of environments and social experiences. Okay. Now, a lack of appropriate sensory exposure, you can actually see symptoms. So if you had a child that, for example, experienced extreme neglect, there are symptoms that you may see in your child that has experienced neglect, such as they become very hypersensitive to sensory input. Or they are hyposensitive, meaning that they're craving sensory input. And so you see where it doesn't matter how much sensory input you give them, that they still need sensory input. You can see hypersensitivity related to tags, socks, underwear. It can also be certain textures of clothing, like they won't wear jeans, but they'll only wear sweatpants. So you can see just an abnormal, different types of symptoms around sensory input. Also, temperature can also be a problem. They can be hypersensitive to temperatures, or, for example, they can easily become hot and overwhelmed. Or if you've had the opposite, where they're hyposensitive. At the boarding school, we would see teenagers, it would be snowing outside, there would be snow on the ground, and they're walking outside in shorts and flip-flops, right? And so again, there can just be, where they're not physically feeling appropriately, and therefore there's a hyposensitivity to temperature. Also, you can see when they get in crowds, you can see an increase of hyperactivity, because again, when a child is struggling with sensory processing, that can be a coping mechanism where they become more hyperactive. And then also too, you can see where they struggle with certain foods or textures, or certain sounds, right? So these are just examples, when you see a lack of appropriate sensory exposure, how they can easily become anxious when there is a lot of sensory exposure. Now, this is actually from the ADD Attitude magazine, which I love, because you'll see in a second that we also use a picture of an iceberg. But basically, what they were saying in this article and what they were saying in research is that the tip of the iceberg is just the obvious symptoms, the visible symptoms that you're experiencing. It could be hyperactivity, lack of emotional control, inattention and focus struggles, or hypersensitivities. But yet there's a lot going on underneath, that's beneath the surface, that there are not so obvious symptoms. Matter of fact, oftentimes children that are diagnosed with ADHD or ADD, there are other symptoms that aren't as discussed. And it's also the same with children that have experienced adverse experiences, that there are some prevalent symptoms that are going on, but yet there can also be some other things that you may not be aware that's also connected. Because what the research is showing is that children that have lack of sensory exposure and motor movement exposure, or just exposure to positive environments as a whole, it impacts the way their brain develops, and therefore they can have weak brain connectivity. And when there's weak brain connectivity, it can cause other symptoms like sleep disturbances, delay in brain maturation, having difficulties with learning, low frustration levels, poor executive functioning skills, which basically is a fancy word for independent skills, being able to think ahead, being able to plan out. So oftentimes children that have weak brain connectivity can struggle with executive functioning skills. And then also they can have anxiety as well, depression, OCD, and even ODD, which is that oppositional defiant disorder. So all to say that what the research is showing is that not only can you have a child that has a specific diagnosis, but there can be other symptoms that are also related to weak brain connectivity that you might not even be considering. Here's a poll question for you, because one of the things that's really interesting that we're seeing 3 years out after experiencing COVID and the COVID lockdown is that if we think about it, all of us went into a season where we had lack of sensory exposure, right? We were all in our homes. We were all working from computers, many of us. Our kiddos were not in school. They weren't able to play with other children. They weren't able to be as hands-on in their learning environments. So all to say that in the last several years, all of us have experienced some changes in the way that we have been exposed to our environment. Our environment changed drastically. So here's a question for you is, do you feel like the pandemic caused new challenges for you or your child that you're still trying to overcome now? Because one of the things that's really interesting is that we are seeing an increase of our children that were babies, and 1 and 2 years old are now coming into brain balance, right? Because that whole experiential learning for that brain at such a young age was impacted. It was very different than what quote unquote the norm was. So sure enough, 71% of you guys say yes, absolutely. We feel like we have more challenges since the pandemic. And that's really what we're also seeing in our centers as well. But here's the bottom line is the research says that what's really going on when you have a child that is struggling with behavior, focus, memory retention, academics, life skills, and social skills, it often comes down to a lack of brain connectivity. So if we think about our children that have experienced hard things, and yet in that utero to the first 18 months of life, it's really critical that they do have sensory stimulation, motor stimulation, that their motor, gross motor, fine motor is developing so that brain can develop. So all to say that when you have these environmental factors that impact the way that their brain is able to develop, it just sets them up for a lack of brain connectivity. And so that's really when we think about, instead of just focusing on the symptoms that your child has related to a diagnosis, it's really coming to an understanding that perhaps your child's brain connectivity is weaker due to the environment that they experienced at a young age. So when we think about all these symptoms that we've just talked about, anxiety, depression, difficulty with relationships, hyperactivity, lack of self-regulation, lack of empathy, difficulty in learning, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Those are those visible symptoms, right? But what you can't see is how is their brain growing and developing, and how is their brain processing? Because for optimal processing in the brain, all right, you have to have optimal sensory processing. You have to have optimal gross motor development, fine motor development, because senses develop the brain and motor develops the brain. And so when we need that brain to process optimally, all right, I say a connected brain is a teachable brain. An optimal processing brain is a teachable brain. All right, so we're going to talk about today, okay, what could be going on? Where are there perhaps weaknesses in the way that my child's brain is developing? And also, when children have experienced hard things, their brain, out of survival, can actually overdevelop in certain areas. And that's something else that we'll talk about today. But all to say that when we're looking at brain balance, when we're looking at how your child's brain is processing, we have to look at the foundations of what needed to develop for your child to have optimal processing in the brain. So one of the first things we look at is what we call primitive reflexes. Now, primitive reflexes are survival reflexes. They're involuntary motor movements. They originate in the brainstem and they're present after birth. And in early child development, they facilitate in survival. All right. So these are central nervous system motor responses that should be inhibited by a year of age. Okay, because as the brain is maturing, these primitive reflexes should integrate and should no longer be active. All right, but here's the thing. The way the brain develops is through sensory development and through motor development. And so their sensory systems have to develop and their motor systems have to develop for these primitive reflexes to actually be inhibited. Because the reason why primitive reflexes should be inhibited is because the brain is maturing and they no longer need these survival reflexes. Let me give you an example. All right. So primitive reflexes are active at birth. All right. And in the first several months of life, think about a baby, right? A baby relies to be cared for, right? They're completely helpless. They're not able to care for themselves. All right. But these primitive reflexes, all right, are active. And so if you actually watch a baby, they're constantly moving. All right. But all to say, these primitive reflexes, because they're housed in the brainstem, each person, all of us, have two nervous systems. We have what we call a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system. All right. And primarily, you want to function out of your parasympathetic. Parasympathetic means that you're safe and secure. All right. Parasympathetic means that your nervous system recognizes you're safe and secure. Therefore, your body and your nervous system is in a state of rest and digest, meaning that your heart rate is normal. You're able to digest your food appropriately. You're able to actually be calm and because you're safe and you feel secure. And so your nervous system is in a place of calm. That's parasympathetic. Then you have sympathetic. Sympathetic is where you can go into, again, more of the brain stem and function more out of the emotional area of the brain than the area of reasoning. When you're in parasympathetic, okay, and your child's in parasympathetic, they can access what I call like the upstairs part of the brain. They can reason and critically think, okay, when they become older. All right. In sympathetic, this is where they're in fight, flight, or freeze. This is when the nervous system is really challenged and the nervous system feels like they're not safe, they're not secure. And so they shift into survival. All right. And this is where you have the fight, flight, or freeze state. And so this is where you can see behaviors, you can see meltdowns, you could see children hitting, kicking, biting. You can see children run. But all to say that you have a sympathetic and you have a parasympathetic. And granted, if you're in danger, you want to respond out of your sympathetic nervous system. You want to be in fight mode, right? But oftentimes, children that have experienced hard things, their nervous system can easily become dysregulated and can easily shift back into sympathetic. Another reason why a child can easily shift into sympathetic is if they still have active primitive reflexes. Because primitive reflexes, again, they are there when the child is born, and then it's through senses that develop the brain and motor develops the brain. However, when a child perhaps has experienced neglect or have experienced hard things, maybe they didn't get that sensory exposure. Maybe they didn't get that motor exposure. And so the brain is delayed in developing. And when there's a delay in development, oftentimes these primitive reflexes can remain. They can still be active. They can be active in a 5-year-old. They can be active in an 8-year-old, a 12-year-old. They could be active in an adult. Okay. And so here you have where something happens. It may not even be that difficult. It could be that you decided that you guys had to change in where you were going after school, and your child thought that you guys were going straight home, and yet you have to stop and go to the grocery store. And yet all of a sudden you have your child in the back seat kicking your seat and throwing a huge meltdown because there's a change in the schedule. Well, oftentimes it could be that there is an active primitive reflex that is causing them to shift more into that sympathetic response where they're more in fight, flight, or freeze. All right. And so we often can see that when primitive reflexes are still active, when they shouldn't be, their nervous system can easily become dysregulated. So, for example, we call it, and I call it kind of your meltdown reflex, the Moreau reflex. Now, the Moreau reflex in a baby, when a baby hears a loud noise, the baby startles, right? And can easily start crying because, again, that nervous system senses danger. However, as the baby grows and develops and their brain is developing, all right, and they have more reasoning skills, they shouldn't have this Moreau reflex any longer or this startle reflex. But many times children that have experienced trauma, this is a survival mechanism in the brain where they still can have an active Moreau reflex, which can really impact emotional regulation because their nervous system is easily shifting from parasympathetic into sympathetic without them even understanding why. And so oftentimes you can have a heightened state of alertness where you can literally see your child have anxiety, inflexibility, emotional dysregulation. Their sensory systems become heightened because their nervous system feels like there's danger going on. And so then that can impact all areas of life. It's going to impact their ability to learn. It's going to impact social and emotional development. It's going to impact their ability to become independent adults. It's going to impact their ability to handle change. So all to say that many times when we see a lack of brain connectivity, we often can see children still have retained primitive reflexes. And so that's one of the first things we look at brain balance is, does your child have any retained primitive reflexes that's just impacting the way their brain is functioning? It also impacts the way their brain develops as well. And this is where you can see anxiety, irritability, and mood instability. So, are there times that you see your child or teen or young adult revert to immature behaviors and emotions that when they are stressed or scared, you feel like that this is when you can see immature behaviors, that they can easily become stressed, scared, or overstimulated? But when your child is in this state, it's almost like there's no reasoning, right? You can't even reason with them because they're not accessing the reasoning area of the brain. They're actually responding out of that lower region of the brain that is responding out of emotions. And so I often encourage parents to just remember when you see this type of behavior that it's their nervous system that's dysregulated. It's so hard times it's so easy to get frustrated, right? When your child constantly is struggling with behaviors that are inappropriate. But if you're not able to reason with your child, then their nervous system is in a state of stress. Their nervous system's in a state of anxiety. And so it's really their nervous system is dysregulated, and it has nothing to do with their character or who they are as a child or a person, but it's really being able to focus more on how do I get their nervous system back in a state of calm, functioning more out of parasympathetic versus this sympathetic response. Sure enough, 96% of you guys say yes, that you guys experience this, on very frequently. But here's the thing is that, of course, the Moreau reflex is very common, but there are also other reflexes that can still be present that can be impacting the way your child's brain is functioning and developing. We have what we call the palmar reflex, which can really impact the development of fine motor skills. So when there's a weak fine motor system, this is going to impact their ability to have self-care and grooming. So being able to snap buttons, zip things, getting dressed independently, being able to groom themselves independently. They might be messy eaters and have difficulties with using utensils. And then, of course, cognitively, they can struggle with handwriting, with having an appropriate grip, with even mouse manipulation related to technology. So all to say that there are other primitive reflexes that we look at, because when there is a weakness in the way that your child's brain is developing, it can also cause other primitive reflexes to be retained. And so then you can see symptoms in other areas. Another example is that we have what we call the tonic labyrinthothene reflex, which can impact the development of gross motor skills and the gross motor system. And when you have weak gross motor systems, it's going to impact multiple areas. When they have weak core strength and weak body awareness, guess what? Body awareness and their ability to physically feel their body, their ability to move their body in space appropriately, their ability to be able to process what they're feeling. Okay, that is the foundation for the development of empathy. So I often talk with parents about like the mind map of me, you, and we. But the first foundational element is they have to have the mind map of me. They have to be able to physically feel their own body. They have to be able to move their body in space appropriately. They have to have coordination. They have to be able to connect. What are they feeling physically to then be able to connect to their emotions? And then if they're not able to connect to themselves, they're not going to be able to connect to others and be able to put themselves in other people's shoes, because they're very disconnected with themselves. So primitive reflexes can even impact body awareness, which can then impact the development of empathy. It can also impact hand-eye coordination, which can impact their ability to play sports or to learn how to ride a bike, to have appropriate balance. And then also it can impact multisensory processing and focus, because again, your child's brain has to be able to process multiple senses simultaneously. They have to be able to handle multiple motor movements simultaneously to be able to do basic daily living tasks. So if there's a weakness and there are underdevelopments in their primitive reflexes, that's going to impact the development of the gross motor system. It can impact the development of fine motor systems. And so all to say, your child's brain is going to have more of a weak connectivity, which will impact their overall functioning. So all to say, when all systems are working together, okay, then basically your child's brain can be optimized for accurately processing the world. However, when there's retained primitive reflexes, it impacts each sensory system differently. And when you have weak sensory systems, then it's going to impact their visual system, their auditory system. It can impact their fine motor functions, their gross motor functions. It can impact their body awareness, which will then impact the development of executive functioning. It can impact their development of having interpersonal relationships, professionally, socially, with family, siblings, and peers. It can also impact the development of their academic performance, from focus and attention to retrieving information to memory to just being able to learn. So all to say, we need these primitive reflexes to be integrated. They need to be completely not present by the time your child is at between a year and 18 months of age. But to understand perhaps why your child may still have primitive reflexes. It can be because of lack of sensory exposure and motor movements. Another thing we have to look at is we look at the way the brain develops, okay, which is what I spent time just talking about. But then we also have to look at the hemispheres of the brain. So there's two hemispheres. We have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. And what the research shows is that a balanced brain is a teachable brain. A connected brain is a teachable brain. And we need both hemispheres of the brain cross communicating effectively and efficiently. Okay. They need to be able to be well connected. But each hemisphere, they have complementary functions. Okay. The right hemisphere, I often like to give you an example of, it's almost as if it's a brake pedal of the brain. Whereas the left hemisphere of the brain, I liken it to the gas pedal of the brain. It's your processing hemisphere. So you have left hemisphere is gas pedal, right hemisphere is brake pedal. The left hemisphere of the brain is responsible for remembering facts and details. It's about verbal communication. It's about fine motor skills. It's logical and linear thinking. It's your IQ. It's also about action. So taking action and movement, but also related to positive emotions because it's all about approach. Okay, so not just happy, but anger is also a left brain emotion because it's about going and taking action. Also, it's about conscious actions and conscious memory. So conscious actions, conscious memory, and then it's also, like I said, your processing hemisphere. So visual processing, auditory processing. Now, the right hemisphere of the brain is that ability to physically feel your body. It's your unconscious actions and unconscious memory, okay? It's also about the ability to see the big picture, nonverbal communication, so reading facial expressions, being able to understand abstract concepts. It's also about big motor movements, core strength, muscle tone, the ability to physically feel your body. And so here's the thing, is that between utero and the first 18 months of life, the right hemisphere of the brain is very critical for development. The mother's role in the right hemisphere is really key. And so all to say that when we think about development, sensory development, the right hemisphere is about the modulation of sensory input. So the ability to regulate sensory input is more of a right hemispheric function. Also, too, gross motor development. So when we think about a baby lifting their head, rolling over, sitting up, crawling for 4 months, standing up and walking, gross motor is really key for right brain development. And gross motor continues to develop throughout a child's life into adulthood. And so that's something to consider as well, is analyzing what is your child's motor functions related to other children their age. Okay. But the right hemisphere is really important, and then the left hemisphere is also important. So both hemispheres need to be equally developing. They need to be constantly communicating, and they need to have strong connections between the two hemispheres of the brain. I often like to share with parents that the right hemisphere is about sense of self and sense of being, whereas the left hemisphere of the brain is more about, like, it's good that I'm alive, I have purpose, I have destiny. It's about action. But you really need to have both hemispheres of the brain cross communicating effectively and efficiently. And to be able to do that, they need to be equally developing. So when we have a child that has experienced hard things as a young, as a young age, that can impact the development of their brain, and it can even impact specifically a right hemispheric function or a left hemispheric function. So that's something that we have to look at as well, is because oftentimes, just like I said, that when children are in survival mode, there can be areas of their brain that develop out of survival, where they're even overdeveloped. And then there can be areas of the brain that are underdeveloped. But all to say that if there's an imbalance in developing taking place, then that's also when you're going to see a disconnect and you're going to see a lot of symptoms because that brain isn't able to cross communicate effectively and efficiently. It's all about connectivity in the brain. It's all about synchrony of the brain. But when you have underdevelopments taking place, you can actually see an asynchrony where there's an imbalance in skill sets. And so at Brain Balance, this is something that we really look at is we look at right hemispheric functions and left hemispheric functions because oftentimes there's a root of a specific hemisphere that is causing an imbalance in the brain. So right side of the brain is all about flexible thinking. It's about unconscious memory. It's about emotional intelligence and sensory perception and gross motor skills. Whereas the left side or the left hemisphere of the brain is about patterns and repetition. It's about conscious memory. It's about intellectual intelligence. It is about sensory processing. So just the ability to be able to process multiple senses. Whereas again, the right hemisphere is about the perception of those senses. So you see how both hemispheres are really important for overall processing of senses. And then the left hemisphere is also about fine motor development. So each hemisphere has different responsibilities, but yet at the end of the day, it's all about it cross communicating. It's all about the connectivity and the synchrony between the two hemispheres that creates a teachable brain. And that's what our goal is at Brain Balance is we want to have a connected brain to have a teachable brain. Many times parents will say, Amanda, I feel like I'm a broken record, that I'm saying the same thing over and over and over again, and it's just not sticking or they're not connecting to it. And so that's where that's a sign and a symptom of underconnections in the brain that's impacting the cross communication of the brain. So all to say that the stronger our brain connectivity is, the more accurately our brains can process information around us. And that's what's really important to remember is that we need to have connectivity in the brain. We need to have cross communication of the brain. And at the end of the day, that's what our goal. There's a lot of research, though, coming out more and more every day, just talking about the role specifically of the right hemisphere. Dr. Alan Shore proposes in his studies that early psychological damage of the unconscious system, which is the right hemisphere, is equated with the enduring impact of relational trauma on the developing right brain. Another researcher, Chalazi and Beasley, says that the unconscious guidance of attention, so again, the need for that right hemisphere, is really key for overall attention and maintaining attention. And also that there are some unconscious functions to be able to maintain attention. The right hemisphere is critical for development of sense of self and sense of being, and it's the foundation for attachment. It's the foundation for empathy and having relationships with others. So more and more, you can see that there's more research coming out talking about the role of the right hemisphere. A growing body of studies documents that unconscious processing of emotional information is mainly succumbed in the right hemisphere, the subcortical route, and that unconscious emotional memories are stored in the right hemisphere. That this hemisphere is centrally involved in maintaining a coherent, continuous, and unified sense of self. So all to say that we really need to look at right hemispheric development when it comes to attachment, when it comes to social and emotional development. And that also too, we have to look at also the connectivity between the two hemispheres of the brain for overall sense of well-being. You really have to have both, and you need both hemispheres cross communicating effectively and efficiently. So here's a question for you. Are you concerned that your child, teen, or young adult will struggle with some of the following due to the experiences that they've gone through? Are you concerned about failure to launch or academic success? And failure to launch means, are you concerned that they're going to live with you for past the years that they're supposed to, right? By the time they turn 18, they need to be thinking about what's next, right? They need to be thinking about what they want to do, and they need to have a good, strong set of independent skills. They need to be driving. They need to basically be, even being able to work independently, even as a part-time job. Like those independent skills really start in high school, right? And they really start in middle school, honestly. But teaching them different levels of independence throughout a child's entire life is really important for them growing up. So here we have failure to launch, we have academic success, social relationship skills, emotional regulation skills. Wow. And 73% of you guys say that you're concerned with all of the above. And I just want to let you guys know that next month, it will actually be a brand new webinar that we're launching on the specific topic of what are the signs and symptoms for failure to launch. So this is also an area that we're really seeing a lot of concern around. And there's a lot of research about it. And we're going to talk about the root causes of why you may have a teenager that you're concerned that they're not going to be able to be independent. So that is next month's webinar. All right, so here I've presented for you guys, the importance of right brain development, the importance of left brain development, the importance of synchrony in the brain and connectivity in the brain. So now let's talk about, okay, yes, you're probably thinking, okay, this is my child. Like I experience this with them every day. What do we do about it? And this is where I want you to be encouraged, because the good news is that we can strengthen brain connectivity. Your child's brain is still growing and developing. It's not too late. And it doesn't matter if they're an adult, a young adult, or if they're a child. The research shows that we can improve and strengthen brain connectivity throughout a person's entire life. So that's the good news, is that the brain can change. We can improve the function of the brain throughout a person's entire life. How do we do that? Well, here's what the research says, is that we have to use a unique combination of exercises that impact not only both sensory, but also their motor systems at the same time, meaning that the most effective way to activate and develop the brain is by multiple sensory stimulation. So visual stimulation, auditory stimulation, even olfactory, which is smell, even tactile stimulation. So multiple sensory stimulations simultaneously with increased intensity over a period of time, pairing it with gross motor development and fine motor development. But what makes brain balance unique is that we can also look at things from a hemispheric perspective. We can really focus on that right brain development that perhaps maybe your child has some gaps in. We can focus specifically on left brain development. So dependent upon where the areas of weakness is, we can actually create a customized plan to address those areas of weakness. But you have to do it through multiple sensory stimulations simultaneously with increased intensity over a period of time. That's what the research says. But here's the good news too, is that environment impacts brain development. We've talked about this today, right? We've talked about the adverse experiences that your child experienced. Well, guess what? You can provide new experiences for them, and you can focus on really helping activate their nervous system and activate their brain to be able to grow and develop. So, all to say, you can use sound to activate the brain. And there are specific sounds that help with a child being able to feel calm, feel safe, feel secure. And then also there's certain smells that activate the area of the brain that helps calm their nervous system, such as peppermint, eucalyptus, lemon, lavender, pine. There's also certain colors that activate the area of the brain for calming, which are your blues, your purples, your greens. And even being able to do some sensory work is also super helpful for reducing their anxiety. We have this awesome handout that it will be emailed to you as a follow-up. And really, it talks about stress in the brain and how you can utilize their senses to help reduce their nervous system to come out of fight, flight, or freeze and go more into a parasympathetic response. This handout is also super helpful if you have professionals or family members that are working with your child. The more sources you can provide for family members and also professionals that are working with your child, the more they'll understand what your child's gone through and what they're going through. And so this gives you some really good insight on what's going on in their brain, but then also how do you calm their nervous system to get them out of that fight, flight, or freeze. Also, there are other resources that are available that are other guides. Like I said, if you call your local Brain Melon Center and tell them that you've watched this webinar and that you want them to email you the self-esteem guide, you want them to email you the sensory meltdown, how to build a sensory travel kit guide, that you want the music and sounds guide, that you want them to email that to you. But we have several guides that are super helpful, not only for you as a parent, but also for family members. Of course, the holidays are coming up. So there's resources there that you can ask family members to purchase certain things that could help with your child and their nervous system. So all to say, please contact your local center for more information. So all at the end of all of this, there's a few things I want you to think about. If you have gone through this webinar and you're like, Amanda, you are describing my child, I am definitely having a greater understanding of why we're experiencing the symptoms we're experiencing, that it's connected to lack of brain connectivity, that it's connected to maybe some underdevelopments taking place in their brain, even overdevelopments taking place in their brain. So what do we do? Well, what I would encourage you to do is to contact a center and schedule an appointment. And what they're going to do is they're going to give you insight exactly on why your child is specifically struggling with the symptoms you're experiencing. They're going to look at, does your child have primitive reflexes? If so, which ones? And what types of symptoms could you be seeing because of primitive reflexes? They're going to assess and look at their sensory perception and their sensory processing. They're going to look at their visual system, their auditory system, their ability to feel, their ability to smell. They're also going to look at their motor functions, gross motor, fine motor. They're also going to look at their eye tracking, specifically to reading and academics. But also we're able to give you insight on that right hemispheric function versus that left hemispheric function. And that's what makes Brain Balance unique than any other program out there. So all to say, you can call your local center, book an assessment, and they're going to provide answers specifically for your child. And then basically from there, we can create a customized plan. We have several options. We have at-home program options. We have in-center options. There's a variety of options that we can customize to meet your family's needs. And so that's what I would recommend, is taking the next step of getting answers perhaps specifically about your child on why they are struggling. We can give you insight on how their brain is processing. We can give you insight on their strengths in brain function. And also, are there any weaknesses that could be impacting that cross communication of the brain, that can be impacting the synchrony of the brain. So these are the phone numbers to the centers. Of course, we have texting numbers that have been in the chat. And then, of course, I'm sure there's some Q&As. But like I shared with you, we are going to have a different webinar next month, which I'll tell you about in a second. But also tonight, if you are like, oh my gosh, this is helpful information, I need my spouse to listen to this, guess what? We'll be here live tonight at 8 p.m. Central Time. It will be live again. I'll be sharing the same webinar tonight. And please share this with a friend, share this with your spouse, maybe share it with your family. If you have family members that are really struggling with understanding what you're going through, perhaps get your family members on so they have a better understanding of what is going on with your child. And then next month, we're doing a failure to launch webinar. So we're going to look at what are the red flags for failure to launch? What are some things that is it something to be concerned about or not? So it's a real hot topic right now, and this is something for sure. What do you need to know to raise an independent teen and young adult? So feel free to Zoom in next month. You'll have to sign up again for the webinar. It'll be posted tomorrow, and that is definitely something that's available to you as well. But thank you again so much for joining us today. I do think we have time. Ooh, man, we have maybe time for 1 or 2 questions. But for sure, you can join us tonight or have your family and friends join us tonight as well at 8 o'clock. But let's see, what's 1 or 2 questions that we have for us?
All right, Amanda, we got a lot of questions around whether trauma or prolonged stress changes the brain if that trauma or prolonged stress is happening at an older age, the same way that it would if it was happening in early childhood.
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, prolonged stress can actually impact brain function. It can impact memory. It can impact the way that you process, right? And so it's absolutely something to consider, even related to adulthood. And so there's lots of a variety of things you can do, but you can do brain exercises to help get your brain out of fight, flight, or freeze more into the area of reasoning and comprehension. So the answer is yes, prolonged stress can impact brain function as well. It's a good question.
Thanks, Amanda. For families that maybe have done other therapies, seen therapists or counselors, and they just haven't seen the change that they're looking for, what is it that's different about brain balance that might give them the change that they're looking for?
Sure. So, at the boarding school, we worked with 10 therapists. And so I love therapists. They're extremely helpful. And oftentimes they're super helpful for the parents just as much as they are for the child, right? Because when you're having a parent, a child that's experienced hard things, your parenting has to be different. You cannot parent, and I know many of you guys out there would agree with me, right? Like maybe you started trying to parent the way that you parented, your biological children or, a child that had a typical upbringing, and you realize really quickly you can't parent them the same. And that is very true. You can't parent them the same. So therapists are super helpful for that. But one of the things where a therapist is helpful is when your child's able to reason and critically think. And so when you have a child that is easily dysregulated and they're often in fight, flight, or freeze, or they're functioning more out of their sympathetic nervous system versus parasympathetic, you may see the coping skills and the cognitive strategies not work because their brain isn't cognitively reasoning and critically thinking appropriately. And so that's why at Brain Balance, we look at things from a neurological perspective. And our goal at Brain Balance is to create a brain that's teachable. So when you go to counseling, then the counseling works, right? The skills that they've been taught, they can actually utilize those skill sets and they can actually use those coping skills. And so, that is the role of Brain Balance is if you have a child that you really just feel like they're not learning, they're not socially and emotionally developing, they're really stuck, then oftentimes it's related to brain connectivity and it's related to their brain is really struggling with being teachable. And so when we can improve brain connectivity, we can improve, the way that the brain is able to process, then learning at school becomes easier. Learning, with the therapist and the activities that the therapist does to process their trauma actually works. because there's definitely a level of processing trauma that is important for overall healing. And we want our children to be able to heal and be able to process what they've experienced. But what brain balance specializes in is creating a brain that's teachable and creating a brain that can process. And so that is the role of brain balance. And then once you have more of a connected brain, then being able to partner with a therapist and be able to work on processing the trauma maybe that your child's experienced will be more effective. And so at Brain Balance, many centers actually have partnered with therapists and work and collaborate with therapists all the time because there's definitely a place for that. And again, we want your child's brain to be teachable. So, good question, really good question.
Awesome. Thanks, Amanda. We've got one more really good question in the similar vein, but how does a brain balance evaluation or assessment differ from an assessment that a family may have done with a psychologist or with a school?
Good question. So oftentimes, a assessment from a psychologist or a school is telling you the what, right? They're telling you that, your child's struggling in these areas. Your child has these symptoms, which then qualifies them for this diagnosis. What Brain Balance does is we tell you the why. We tell you why is your child experiencing those symptoms? Why is your child struggling? And what's going on in their brain that's causing them to behave that way or to function in the way that they're functioning. So that's the difference between a brain balance assessment and other assessments out there. Many assessments tell you the what, and brain balance tells you the why. And then we put together a customized plan to strengthen the brain overall, but also too, we look at things, from a hemispheric perspective and a developmental perspective. So we have to look at it from both perspectives to get the best customized plan for your family and for your child. So hopefully that answers that question. All right. Well, I went a little over today, and I want to thank you so much for joining us again. This is definitely a topic I'm super passionate about. And I really hope that this gave you insight. There is one more questionnaire or one more poll as you exit today. Please feel free to give your opinion on this webinar. This is a newer webinar for us, so we definitely want to continue to perfect and improve the information that we provide for you. We really want it to be helpful for you. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Again, we'll be back here tonight at 8 p.m. Share it with friends, share it with a spouse. And again, we'll be here live tonight at 8 p.m. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, everyone.